Veganism is an applied ethical position that advocates for the equal trait-adjusted application of commonplace human rights, such as the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to non-human sentient beings. This is the definition of veganism created by Nick Hybert, also known as the Nutrivore, that I follow and will advocate for in this video. My thesis is that this definition more accurately captures the ethical philosophy held by people who label themselves as vegan, while avoiding the pitfalls of ambiguity and inconsistency found in other definitions. You might be wondering, don't we already have a definition? You're probably thinking about the Vegan Society's definition of veganism. However, this definition has some significant problems that a lot of vegans are not aware of. I think it ultimately fails to capture the ethical philosophy that people who label themselves vegan hold. The definition states that veganism is a philosophy and way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as is possible and practicable, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose, and by extension promotes the development and use of animal-free alternatives for the benefit of animals, humans, and the environment. In dietary terms, it denotes the practice of dispensing with all products derived wholly or partly from animals. The problems I see with this definition are as follows. Firstly, it exclusively focuses on animals as opposed to all sentient beings. Additionally, it deems consumption of animal products in cases that do not contribute to demand as non-vegan. And finally, it delineates cases in which it is acceptable for animal products to be consumed with ill-defined words of vague obligation, such as possible and practicable. To address the first point, we need to think deeply about what we're committing ourselves to by talking exclusively about animals. I believe what vegans really care about is sentience. While the only sentient beings we know of are animals, it's not necessarily the case that only animals can be sentient. If we were visited by intelligent aliens, for example, would it be acceptable to kill and eat them? I'd say most vegans would be against this. However, since they're not part of Kingdom Animalia, it would be vegan to chop them up and cook their flesh under the Vegan Society's definition. It would be better to focus on sentient beings rather than merely animals. Also consider the last sentence. In dietary terms, it denotes the practice of dispensing with all animal products derived wholly or partly from animals. Remembering what I'm trying to capture here is an ethical position, I believe this to be a false claim. I don't believe it is wrong to say, eat meat acquired via dumpster diving, because you're not contributing to demand and causing more animals to be killed for your consumer habits. On my view, it is not the dietary consumption of animal products that is wrong, but rather the economic consumption. If you can have the dietary consumption without the economic consumption, then I see no moral issue with partaking in that. Finally, the definition is confusingly ambiguous. It makes use of so-called words of vague obligation, a term I've taken from Ask Yourself. In the case of this definition, I'm talking about the words possible and practicable. These words are added to the definition in an attempt to make exemptions for cases in which it is acceptable to use animal products. Take, for example, propofol. Propofol is a drug used to put people asleep during surgery, which contains a very small amount of egg lecithin. Under the Vegan Society's definition, we can use propofol only if it would not be possible or practicable to go without it. But herein lies the problem. What does that actually mean? If we just look at the dictionary definitions of these terms, here's what we find. Possible. Being within the limits of ability, capacity, or realization. Practicable. Capable of being put into practice or of being done or accomplished. Using these definitions, I fail to see how it is impossible or impracticable to undergo a surgery without using propofol. Strap somebody down until they're completely immobilized and then get to work. That's what we did for hundreds of years before we had propofol. But perhaps the vegan society definition is not referring to possibility simpliciter. It could instead be referring to conditional possibility. For example, as far as is possible and practicable without undergoing extreme pain. However, if they are referring to conditional possibility, then the condition is never specified. Is it possible without being mildly inconvenienced? Is it possible without being subjected to physical or psychological distress? Is it possible without dying? The issue with ambiguity persists. Now, I do think it is acceptable to use propofol, but not because of the false claim that it would be impossible not to. Rather, I think in this particular case, the amount of harm caused by contributing to the animal agriculture industry is so minuscule that it is easily outweighed by whatever benefit the surgery will convey. Equivalent to maybe pinching somebody on the street in return for fixing a broken arm. I don't believe rights are always inviolable, and these cases serve as examples in which it is okay to violate those rights. While I and most vegans do believe there are situations where using animal products is okay, these situations are not determined by the limits of possibility. But by using the vegan society's definition, it seems vegans would be obligating themselves to undergo extreme suffering because it's still possible and practicable to be awake during surgery under the dictionary definitions of those terms. A definition of veganism that fails to track with the ethics of people who label themselves as vegan is this flawed and suffers from ambiguity is simply not philosophically robust enough to be the definition used by the animal rights movement. It should be abandoned. The definition given at the beginning of this video does not suffer from these issues and is therefore superior and should be adopted in its place. Recognizing the issues with the vegan society's definition, some vegans may prefer to simplify things and use a mere dietary definition. For example, veganism is the practice of not consuming any animal products. This definition, or one close to it, is used by Ask Yourself. Variations of this definition could specify economic consumption and therefore cover non-food items such as leather. It benefits from being completely unambiguous and clear. However, what I'm seeking is to find a philosophically robust definition, particularly one that describes veganism as an ethical philosophy. Not eating animal products may be a consequence of veganism as I define it, but not the whole philosophy itself. Despite this, I do think that in certain situations, for example social contexts, this definition may be good enough, or potentially the best definition, while keeping the definition I gave at the start of this video in reserve if somebody wants to dig into the nuances. This is because if I give this definition, I know nobody is going to serve me anything non-vegan. There's no need when somebody asks what the definition of veganism is for them to be assaulted by philosophical jargon. So I think there is a place for this definition, but only as a rough outline and not to be established as the conclusive definition of veganism. To explore one more alternative, perhaps we can draw up a definition that focuses purely on ethical consistency. An example of this definition could be the extension of normative ethics consistently applied to encompass non-human sentient beings. Now let me disambiguate this. Normative ethics is, in short, a person's criteria of what is right and wrong. What you can do to somebody is determined by your normative ethics. However, animals are often left out of the equation. What this definition is saying is that veganism means to take your normative ethics, for example, utilitarianism or deontology, and apply it towards non-human sentient beings such that they are protected under it. Unlike the Vegan Society's definition, this definition doesn't make use of any words of vague obligation, so it is free from that mistake. Provided that the words used are understood, I don't believe it has any issues with ambiguity. I believe this definition is far more effective than the previous definitions explored at describing the beliefs of people who label themselves as vegan. Unlike those definitions, it allows for consumption of animal products that do not cause harm to animals. This is because, instead of some strict principle about consumption, it focuses on consistency between your moral code and your actions towards non-human sentient beings. However, there is an unfortunate issue with this otherwise strong definition that I've dubbed the Psychopath Problem. Now imagine somebody is a total psychopath and extends moral consideration to nobody but themselves. They could apply their normative ethics consistently to non-human animals and eat hamburgers all day, yet be considered vegan under this definition. But of course, this doesn't capture what we mean when we talk about veganism. It brings us to a challenging dilemma. It appears we can have a dietary definition which leaves out the moral aspect of veganism, or we can have a moral definition which leaves us susceptible to the psychopath problem. This is the issue with any kind of definition based on ethical consistency. Some people, due to their twisted mentality, are capable of being morally consistent and yet continue to eat animals. Of course, this definition works great most of the time. However, in very rare cases, it allows for the consumption of animal products in such a way that vegans would be opposed to. Therefore, it fails to track with what vegans mean when we describe our ethical philosophy. This is why, once again, I favour the Nutrivore's definition, which I will now go into in more detail. As you will see, this definition has serious implications for the vegan movement going forward. Nick Hybert, known online as the Nutrivore, has provided a definition of veganism that accounts for all the problems stated thus far. As I said at the beginning of the video, he defines veganism as an applied ethical position that advocates for the equal trait-adjusted application of commonplace human rights, such as the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to non-human sentient beings. To disambiguate some of these terms, applied ethics is the branch of ethics that deals with the practical application of moral principles to specific issues. What is meant by trait-adjusted is that humans and non-humans with equalized traits should be regarded as equal. Nick uses the example that we wouldn't give a pigeon the right to vote, but we also wouldn't give a person with the mental capacity of a pigeon the right to vote either. Yet both have the right not to be slaughtered. If this is unclear to you, I recommend watching Ask Yourself's video explaining Name the Trait, a line of questioning that can be delivered to non-vegans to either derive contradictions on their view or reduce their view to absurdity. This definition appears to capture completely, accurately, and unambiguously what I mean and what I believe most vegans mean by veganism. It also manages to avoid the psychopath problem. If somebody believes that a human could be killed and eaten, they still wouldn't be able to eat animals because they wouldn't be applying commonplace human rights. It's not dependent on their own beliefs, rather it's dependent on collective beliefs around rights. There is one serious implication of adopting this definition, although I wouldn't quite consider it a flaw. That is, that this definition focuses on rights, and therefore does not work for utilitarians. However, maybe that's good. I'm not a utilitarian. If we examine utilitarianism, we see that it simply doesn't commit you to the typical beliefs of vegans, such that it is wrong to kill animals for food, even if they have a good life. For example, Peter Singer, ironically dubbed the father of the animal rights movement, is a utilitarian, and he has literally said, quote, "I can imagine a world in which people mostly eat plants, but occasionally treat themselves to the luxury of free-range eggs, or possibly even meat from animals who live good lives under conditions natural for their species, and are then humanely killed on the farm." Every single vegan I know would disagree with this, but of course it is simply a fact that this is entailed by utilitarianism. This is actually something I always liked about the Vegan Society's definition, that it used the intentionally vague word exploitation, rendering it compatible with both utilitarianism and deontology. However, I now think it's time for veganism to move beyond utilitarianism and leave it in the dust. With that, I will now close by delivering what I, at the time of publishing this video, use as my definition of veganism. I've also written my own definitions of vegan as a noun and vegan as an adjective. Veganism, noun, an applied ethical position that advocates for the equal trait-adjusted application of commonplace human rights such as the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights to non-human sentient beings. Example: I watched Dominion, a documentary that argues in favor of veganism. Vegan, noun, somebody who adheres to veganism, especially in such a way that they do not economically consume products, the consumption of which would violate the principles of veganism. Example: after watching Dominion, I decided to become a vegan. Vegan, adjective, a food, service, or other product that can be economically consumed without the consumer violating the principles of veganism. Example: I went to Hungry Jack's and tried their new vegan burger. Vegan, adjective, an activity or behavior that can be partaken in without violating the principles of veganism. Example: when we went camping, I participated in hiking because it was vegan, but I did not participate in fishing because it was not vegan. Vegan, adjective, a place or location that exclusively caters towards vegans. Example: Shift Eatery in Sydney is a vegan cafe. Thank you for watching this video. Please leave a comment below with your thoughts and I'll do my best to respond to all of them. Additionally, if you could like and subscribe, that would help my channel immensely. Goodbye.